A lot of people don't realize that our thoughts exist on a circadian rhythm as well. So that's really exciting research. So one study that we often point to is called the mind after midnight, and how our thoughts in the wee hours of the morning after midnight begin to have a very different flavor or categorization as compared to thoughts that would be happening, say, at noon. Or
I've noticed is that when I'm under stress, I have these 3 o'clock wake ups.
You are not alone. And, out of U.S. News and World Reports, just for 2025, they did a recent survey, and they found 85% or something along those lines of participants finding frequent wake-ups as part of their struggles with their sleep.
The seasonal patterns that occur, the menstrual cycles for women cycling, the women going into perimenopause, menopause, some of those things, and how we can shift our behavior and maybe even our environment to maximize aligning with those rhythms.
When we start looking at these other rhythms, so one, just bare minimum for women, especially women of menstruating age, we have extra things to consider, beyond just our circadian health.
Welcome back to the 90% Healthy podcast. Today, Don and I have a very special guest for you guys. Her name is Mollie Eastman, founder of Sleep is a Skill. And you know us, we talk about things here that helps you build a resilient body and brain without losing your mind. And I gotta say, sleep is something a lot of us lose our minds perfecting or optimizing.
Yeah.
So we're gonna go down a few different rabbit holes, a few different scientific discoveries to talk about how can we get the best night's sleep of our lives. And Mollie, you've been there, done that. You've been the one who struggled with sleep and you've mastered sleep, I want to say, to a point. Maybe
yes,
some nights. You've got
to
a lot.
On the right nights, but yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely on both sides of the spectrum, for sure. And so I can certainly speak to that, the feeling of losing your mind when you're not sleeping routinely. That is not a good feeling. So anyone that might be listening and dealing with that, I have been there, and we've encountered so many people that have also been there. So you're not alone, but also there's so much that we can do. And it's just really important, I think, to hold on to that knowledge that sleep, I believe, is a skill set. And so as we learn and master and bring mastery, continued mastery to this skill set, because things will continue to evolve. I just turned 40, so new hormones, new things. I know, crazy. But, there's different changes as we shift things in our lives and things that we're taking on in our businesses, careers, family, etc. There's going to be new opportunities to gain new skill sets that all feed into how you build and cultivate and take care of your sleep. So I believe it's a lifetime journey, and excited to dive in.
Mollie, you and I met, it's been almost 3 years ago now. I was down at a biohacking event in Miami, and you came wandering past our booth, and again, we clicked right away.
Yes.
Were you still in the process of discovery at that point, or rapid discovery, or had you kind of, figured out the combination for yourself at that point? Tell me about where you were
the
on that.
timeline. Yes, the timeline was really about a decade ago. I went through this period of insomnia while traveling internationally that changed the course of my life. And really what I was looking for then was examples of people that had gotten to the other side of that period of insomnia and were not now left with benzos, Z drugs, all these different things to be able to sleep. Because unfortunately, if you go down the wrong Google rabbit holes, you find a lot of, counter examples of what that can look like. So that period of my life was a real journey into getting my sleep back on track. And that was one when I started going down the rabbit hole of quantum biology, circadian rhythm entrainment. I bought my first $8 blue blockers in 2016, the UVEX ones, like construction workers. So this was a real journey for a bit. And then once kind of conquering and getting my sleep back online, but not even just back to how it had been before, because I'd always identified as a poor sleeper, a bad sleeper, short sleeper, a night owl. It's in my genes. I'll sleep when I'm dead. These labels and narratives that once I started getting my sleep back, then it became this conversation of optimization, which I didn't even think was available for me. And so then this is when Sleep is a Skill began to be born. And now today we have about 7 years worth of Monday newsletters that we've sent every Monday Friday. We never miss a Monday on those. So that's been a really great way to cultivate community. We have a top sleep podcast. So we have almost 300 episodes with different sleep experts in various domains. And then we've also had online courses, cohorts, audits. I was chatting about how we do these wearable audits. We've been linked up, especially with Oura Ring for many, many years. So we have a very large Oura Ring database. So we have the opportunity to kind of see on the ground what are some of those things that really move the needle for people. So out of that journey of about, a decade ago, I'm very grateful to say that I feel like I dodged a bullet, because when I did go to the doctors, multiple doctors along the way, was given many different types of sleeping pills and no real plan. So, I'm thankful. And sadly, I see so many people that that's kind of where the story ends. And then it begins to snowball from there. And then they need more, prescriptions and more, to deal with all the surrounding things that start to kind of fall off track. So I'm really thankful that I began to get into these different conversations, and I'm committed to sharing with people of these alternative paths that sadly are not really shared about enough, that are available for people, not just for sleep optimization, but also sleep disorders, or maybe a little bit of both, because oftentimes people are looking to optimize their sleep and don't even realize that there's over 100 sleep-wake disorders, and that they might be dealing with some that they have no idea about.
So what's interesting about that is you mentioned several things, and I want to start to take this apart just a little
Yeah,
bit.
please.
We started with discussing this thing called circadian rhythm.
Yes.
And really, do you consider that the core of what you do? We've got to go in, and then that rhythm's made up of behaviors, hormones, and metabolites. There's all three contribute here. So let's start at the metabolite level, because I think this is what a lot of listeners hear a lot about. We go back to the classic Thanksgiving dinner. We all show up, we all stuff our faces with turkey. By the afternoon, when the football game's ready to come on, I'm usually curled up in front of the fireplace, not giving a darn about the football game on a Thursday. The one on Saturday I pay attention to. But I've got that belly full of turkey, which is a belly full of tryptophan. And we're like, oh, it's the tryptophan makes you sleep. Fact or fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're pointing to a couple things. So to answer your question around, do we feel like circadian rhythm entrainment is really at its core? And yes, I would say circadian rhythm entrainment is absolutely one of our core elements, that and kind of how we structure when people are going through our programs, looking at important zeitgebers or time givers for their circadian health. And then all of those things in service of mitochondrial health. Some people have heard of that saying, to become, tongue-in-cheek, a bit of a mitochondriac. So a bit of a mitochondriac leaning, and just how important circadian health can be in that journey. And just real quick, some of the zeitgebers and how we organize it are light-dark timing, consistent sleep-wake timing, temperature timing, meal timing on the topic of Thanksgiving and what have you, and then exercise timing, thought timing, which is a really fascinating one, because a lot of people don't realize that our thoughts exist on a circadian rhythm as well. So that's really exciting research. So one study that we often point to is called the mind after midnight, and how our thoughts in the wee hours of the morning after midnight begin to have a very different flavor or categorization as compared to thoughts that would be happening, say, at noon or what have you. And sadly, it can raise suicidality rates, black and white thinking, kind of catastrophic thinking can all happen in those wee hours of the morning. So that's thought timing. And then lastly, chronopharmacology, which for many people with Thanksgiving might also be in there. So the timing of our drugs, which might be our wine, our alcohol, our THC, our coffee, our supplements, our prescriptions, et cetera, et cetera. So the timing of those things and how those can all play a role as well in our sleep. Then we also kind of bonus look at time shifting like a verb, if we are kind of dealing with groups that are frequently hopping time zones, and how much that can kind of wreak havoc on our mitochondrial health, circadian health. And so as it then pulls into something like Thanksgiving, which is such a visceral, beautiful example of how it feels like it can absolutely induce sleep in such a dramatic way for many people. I think what we would point to for many people with that is how much blood sugar can play a role in our sleep health. And so that's a big factor that we look at, knowing that in some research, over 93% of Americans exhibiting some form of metabolic dysfunction. So it makes sense that a lot of people, they would have kind of gorging feast or famine. And so feasting around Thanksgiving and then have all kinds of consequences that show up in how they feel. And I think that can be a great example for day-to-day life of if that can acutely impact you. Imagine, day-to-day, just a little overindulging in dinner and moving that a little too late, and how that might show up in your wake-ups that you're frustrated about, or difficulty falling asleep, or when you do fall asleep, but now you're splintered and sleep fragmentation.
Interesting. So, but when we start to talk about this, as I've started to look at this a little bit, this isn't just kind of working up at an organ level. That when we
Yeah.
look at sleep timing, we actually have genes in every cell. One I see is called a clock gene, actually. One is the
Yeah.
GMAL1, the other is the GMAL1. And these are highly influenced with nicotinamide adenine mononucleotide, or nicotinamide riboside. So we see the fact that a lack of a dietary nutrient can actually throw us off at a
Yes.
genetic level. This isn't, listen, Laura and I drove to Chicago yesterday. We were in Chicago for the day, about a 3-hour drive each way. We got back. I probably had caffeine way too late.
Sure.
Did not have the best night's sleep last night. But
Yeah.
after I got things going today, I just woke up from a wonderful little nap.
Yay. Love that.
So this isn't just it's not an on-off switch. This is a multi-layered symphony that's taking place that starts at the cellular level
Yeah.
and then works it up to tissues, organs, behaviors. When you're working with how deep do you have to go on this?
Yeah, such a good question. So when we're onboarding, especially our one-on-one clients, and then we give optionality in our cohorts for different pricing for some of these, but certainly with our one-on-ones, we do quite a few things. So one, of course, we, it makes a lot of sense that we would give a sleep test, obviously. So we do have everyone that we work with get a sleep test just to see how we're performing from a diagnostic level, and then speak to those over 100 sleep-wake disorders, because that's quite concerning too, because we do see so many people either undiagnosed or untreated. So we'll address that. Then we're often doing glucose monitors. We're bringing in lab testing, so quite extensive there, as well as many tests that many people often aren't testing for. So whether that is mold, microtoxins, heavy metals, etc. And so we're really going quite layered on what some of these things could be that are at the source of some of this disruption for their sleep. And then we're, for most of our people, then also tracking them with an Oura Ring as well. And then, so then we do have times where we're bringing in different layers of different sleep tests that are a little bit more intense, where we can bring in EEG mapping. And so we can periodically look at this throughout the course of the time that we're working with them. So all that to say that there are a lot of things that people just have no idea that they could be testing for that could be massively throwing off their sleep results. So whether, to your point around some of these things that could show up, so we look at different nutritional deficiencies, nutrient deficiencies. We look at issues with thyroid, issues with hormones, issues, from a certainly vitamin D level, other things that might then kind of have this cascading effect into their sleep results. So it's really a layered way of looking at both the snapshot of now, but now not getting too enamored in how it might be at this very moment. Because as we start to bring in so many different protocols and environmental shifts, behavioral shifts, for so many people, those labs look markedly different, both with the behavioral and environmental interventions and also the psychological interventions that come in from a stress response perspective and what have you. And then when we test thereafter down the road, that's what's really fulfilling, is we get to see how much this changing in some of these behaviors as we start to bring sleep back online, how much there's kind of a symbiotic or bi-directional relationship, both in what we might address and find that needs to be handled and spoken into from these labs, but then also as we bring so many things that so many people just sadly aren't doing, for the circadian alignment, once we bring those in, how that will ripple into their lab results, which is really, really fascinating.
How
Go ahead.
soon do you tend to see changes in those lab metrics? And also, how many interventions are you introducing? Like, I often
Yeah.
see people getting overwhelmed when there's a lot
Yes.
that shifts at once. So, what is the usual pattern that you see with your clients in terms of, okay, I can change 2 things for this week or for this month, and then maybe pile on 2 additional ones? What do you see as a trend?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, and certainly there's levels of severity to this game too. I do have a specialty of working with high stakes poker players. So often with my high stakes poker players, they are, might as well be shift workers. All kinds of things are out of whack. So very quickly we can start to see change. But what I would also point to is similar to what we see are these really famous and interesting studies out of the University of Colorado where they took night owls camping, and so they did this for a long week and then a long weekend. And in both cases, they found in the span of a week and in the span of a long weekend that they were able to measurably shift earlier the secretion of melatonin just simply by taking them outside and by removing all electric light sources. But this also then brings about, if you're aligned with the rhythms of nature, you're having a level of consistency as well. So that's one of our other features. We have these anchor habits that we bring in both around light, dark, and consistent wake up timing. And even just with those 2 things alone, which can sound so basic and so silly, but for the average person, as we bring those in, because it does actually take quite something. We mentioned I am standing outside.
Yeah, I
I've
was gonna say,
moved my
yeah.
entire office outside. So it does take some real commitment and sometimes, wind and rain and whatever to get ourselves outside to even to be a tiny amount of what we used to be outside. When we see that in some of those studies, that in such a short period of time, we can measurably, for people that say, no, I'm a night owl, I can't possibly get sleepy and go to bed earlier, that no, we actually can move up quite markedly hours, the time where they're going to be secreting melatonin and actually get sleepy much, much earlier. And our results are very similar, especially for people that all of this is kind of new. We can see in very short period of time where we can start bringing about more consistency. So that looks like couple weeks. Now, what we do know too for CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which does have the most research behind it and high efficacy as far as its impact for people that are dealing with insomnia, difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, that it tends to be about 6 weeks to 8 weeks where we see really substantial change for people when following some of those basic protocols, but then supercharge them with some of these other things that you all know about. But then we layer in quantum health, circadian health, and just it's off to the races.
You mentioned the fact that when we get back in touch with nature, when we get out of the light and so forth, we tend to see
Yeah.
a shift and we see an earlier flow of melatonin. Now, I believe the average person has a bad night's sleep. They go to the pharmacy, they buy a bottle of melatonin thinking this is
Yeah.
going to solve my problem. And I've never been comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Whenever I've seen someone who's struggling with sleep, is far from a nutrient standpoint, I think it's more of
Sure.
a magnesium issue than it is a melatonin issue.
Sure.
But is this something, can the supplementation bring the behavior change, or do you have to build the behavior change in order to support the supplementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, I'm sure we've seen that there are many use cases where taking these external sources of melatonin does have efficacy as far as jet lag, as far as elderly population, certain studies around autism and other cases, and then looking at high viral load cancers, et cetera. So there's certain times where we can see that can make a lot of sense. But what I tend to see day in, day out is that the average person is not making enough melatonin on their own naturally. And then they're are seeking it out externally. And then it's just such an augmented, odd kind of delivery mechanism as compared to what we can, for most of us, be able to cultivate. And then pair those things in with some of the things that you're speaking to, which are also crucial, speaking to the magnesium piece, speaking to some of those other deficiencies that we might be able to identify specifically for those individuals. So, I was just off a call with someone that had very wildly low iodine levels, wildly low vitamin D, this other. So when we see those numbers, we're able to address those thoughtfully versus just sort of like, well, take
Throw something
this,
at the
good
wall.
luck. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But yeah, to your point, melatonin is, much to many people's chagrin, is not like an Ambien or something. It's not, you're not just going to take that and then be out. It's just more of a preparatory hormone, if you will, to help prepare us to
Well,
calm
it,
and
it
lower.
concerns me that when you listen, you've always got to be considerate of when I introduce a ligand of some type, what's missing, why is it missing, and is this going to make it worse? And as I see people who are supplementing melatonin, so many times, listen, they haven't asked me for my opinion. They'll be sitting there
Yeah.
discussing it, but in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, you're making your situation worse.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah,
And
exactly.
okay.
It's certainly not better. In most cases, what we do, or unless they're, then this gets layered, because is it a placebo effect? What is happening when people will say they're having these, which is a very real effect, and certainly very much so in the world of
Mm-hmm.
sleep. But to your point, there's just so many other levels or levers, is that the word? Levers that I would look to than versus the melatonin route. And yet, when we think of, say, those like camping studies, what's just so interesting about those is that they start to poke holes in the chronotypes,
Mm.
steadfast label system. So for many people, when they start talking about sleep, they'll say, oh, well, have you taken your quiz? Are you a bear? Are you a lion? Are you this? And nothing against that, because that can be really, really fantastic, to kind of identify how are things going for me right now, kind of a snapshot, and natures and tendencies. We all have the friends that lean more early leaning. We all have the friends that lean more late leaning. And, we can see that often can be from a young age. So certainly validity to that conversation. However, when we look at studies like those Colorado studies, they start to question, wait a minute, how much of our environmental and
Yeah.
behavioral aspects are skewing many
Yeah.
of us, unfortunately, on the later side. And this is taking us away from this crucial sleep that we tend to get when we are a bit more aligned with these rhythms of nature, these rich levels of deep sleep in the first half of the night, moving into sufficient REM. When you have a lengthy enough sleep opportunity and it's not being impacted on the front end or the back end. So this is where it can get layered, but it does start to hopefully provide more agency for the average person to say, maybe I can design my sleep-wake schedule a bit more than maybe I realize. Maybe I'm not just destined for a particular lot in life.
And I love that you mentioned it. And we talked about, and you mentioned earlier, the dynamic aspect of sleep and just the
Yeah.
dynamic seasonality of everything that we do. And
Yes.
a lot of people have now thrown around the word circadian rhythm. And there's a lot more understanding in the mainstream about what it is. But there are a couple more rhythms that I wanted to touch on, which is the ultradian rhythms and the infradian
So
rhythms.
important.
That one of them is, the seasonal patterns that occur, the menstrual cycles for women
Yes.
cycling, the women going into perimenopause, menopause. So some of those things and how we can shift our behavior and maybe even our environment to maximize aligning with those rhythms that our body tends to thrive on and to continue changing and evolving in this dynamic cycle that we live in.
Yes, this is where that rabbit hole I was alluding to can get really, really layered and fascinating. Because when we start looking at these other rhythms, so one, just bare minimum for women, especially women of menstruating age, we have extra things to consider, beyond just our circadian health. And certainly we all have our ultradian rhythms, so those rhythms less than a day. But when we look at infradian rhythms, these rhythms more than a day, for women especially quite pronounced when we look at our cycle when we are a menstruating age. And this can really measurably throw off some of our results that we might see, even if we do exactly every single thing, every variable is accounted for every day. And yet you're going to see massive swings in various places if you are, for instance, measuring your sleep with different wearables. I was mentioning Dr. Kayla Osterhoff, I think, before we hit record, and she often speaks to how for so long, and you can see maybe why, women have been pulled or had been omitted from many studies because we just have so many variables. We're like 4 different people throughout each month, measurably, from the difference of our hormones. And so you have to really consider some of those components. So that plays a huge, huge role in our sleep results and also the management of our well-being, because if we know, just even zooming out on the most basic, this is very, very blanketed basic statements, but on the second half of our cycle, tending to have a bit more of that sympathetic response state. And if we are in that state, then it might behoove us to maybe abstain from the extra glass of wine, the later meal, that stressful conversation at night, et cetera. I mean, things that maybe across the board, yes, but especially we might just be a little bit more vulnerable in that second half of our cycle. And so when we know better, we might do better. And this can all serve us for better or for worse. I know many people get very frustrated with their wearables and they say, I just want to tell this thing that, it's my period. But it's also trying to help us to get that we are not just men, in dresses or something. We are, thank God, right? Exactly. So, there's some nuance here, but this is all really fascinating because that plays such a huge role. This goes under the umbrella of chronobiology, so the science of time and how time affects our biology.
Have you ever felt overwhelmed? Just one more question before I toss it over to you. You've done so many things, and how did you overcome overwhelm and just wanting to perfect everything? If you ever tried to perfect everything, like what was the story there?
Oh man, if anyone has met me, they know that I'm still in ongoing recovery, but I definitely have the pull towards perfectionistic tendencies. That is for sure. But that's one of the things that becomes so crucial to really address when we're looking at the management of our sleep, when we really go into that thought timing. So really so the gold standard treatment is supposed to be in the United States that CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, before ever prescribing any sleep medications or what have you. And that is for a good reason, because it's really addressing some of our thought processes and tendencies for trying to even perfect sleep. And so that is the paradoxical thing that goes on when we start to look at sleep, which can be very confusing because we're actually looking to release the stronghold on trying to have a perfect night every single night, because we're just not going to have a perfect night every single night. And when we can start to free ourselves up from that, and that can often take some time, but if we can start to do that, there can be power in knowing our resiliency is available. And that's one of the big things that is really underscored in something like CBTI, or also ACT, or acceptance commitment therapy for insomnia, kind of a additional approach, is looking at how can we accept that maybe this is a season of our life when we are a bit wound up and stressed out, and maybe we're not sleeping quite as well or whatever's going on, and to accept that maybe we're having shortened sleep, fragmented sleep, but the less we fight it, like a Chinese finger trap, the more, with more velocity, we can start to kind of heal that relationship, but also know ourselves as resilient and start to collect evidence that, okay, I made it through a day before when I only had 4.5, 5 hours of sleep. I don't want to do it maybe, but I can do it again, and so those things are really important too, because also when we look at hunter-gatherer tribes, they do not have perfect sleep at all. So we would look at like the Hadza tribe in Africa, when we hook them up with all different sleep trackers, they've got all kinds of fragments. They're waking up, they're, searching out this weird noise that's in the space or whatever. And so our tendency of maybe over perfectionistic thinking, like we have to always have this perfect night, is also making us kind of fragile as well.
Yeah, and so let's build on that just a minute, because I know when I first started to go down the sleep rabbit hole a little bit, this is years and years ago, and you recognize, again, my area, I focus on HRV. That's my yes. focus point, and you understand that sleep affects HRV dramatically.
Yeah,
and I was reading Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, and what your perception of a good night's sleep is critical. It's not go to bed, zonk out, be unconscious for 8 hours, and then regain consciousness. When we
Yeah.
look at that, is it the ultradian rhythm, that 90-minute cycle? And I know when I really started paying attention to that, I know that
Mm-hmm.
if I look at my sleep data, either through my Oura or through another device, I
Yeah.
see these rhythms, these internight sleep rhythms,
Yeah.
which is normal and which is part of a good night. And I've gotten to the point to where I rarely set an alarm anymore.
Mm.
Um, that I I am normally, my rhythms wake me up about 7 a.m., right around
Sure.
that time. Now,
Yeah.
if for some reason I wake up at 6:30 or I wake
Mm-hmm.
up at 6, I don't try to go back to sleep anymore. I
Mm.
know that I'm out of this rhythm. Now, if I know I have to get up at 7 and 5:30 for a reason I see the clock at 5:30, I'm like, "Oh, I've got one more cycle on board here. I can go
Yeah.
ahead and go back to sleep and get through this." Am I missing something here? Is that realistic, or what? Tell me about your thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you're pointing to that because if we zoom out, what are and 'cause when we talk about sleep, so many of us we're looking to optimize our sleep. We know we don't feel maybe always so well rested, but we don't really know necessarily much about it because we're kind of in this altered consciousness state. So that's where one, I think wearables can shine as long as we're not trending into obsessive domains, which can sometimes happen. So sometimes we need a data vacation. But I think these wearables can sometimes help paint a picture of what is available when we create sufficient sleep opportunity. And when we do that, certain things, there's kind of reliable things that tend to happen. So, one, if we know ourselves as the type that tends to stay up late, which has been for some people coined as revenge bedtime procrastination, fun phrasing of the tendency for us to steal time away from no one but ourselves, really, and procrastinate on going to bed. So if that is someone listening, then what they're tending to do is lob off the first half of their night, which tends to be more deep sleep rich. Our sleep does and our bodies do try to stay on time. We've talked about the importance of those rhythms and these clocks in virtually every cell and organ in our body are like to be kind of Scandinavian or Swiss in tendencies around being really regimented. And so you tend to cut off some of that first half of that deep sleep, which is really crucial if you are going to bed later. Now, in the morning, if we tend to sometimes find ourselves, whether for by design or maybe not by design, of waking up throughout the course of the night, or we wake up early and now we're questioning, do we just get up or what do we do? If that's happening consistently, then there can be the impact of our REM sleep because that tends to be on the end of our nights. And REM you can think of as almost like your inner therapist for one of the many things that it does, but that can be a nice reductionistic way of looking at it, that it helps to emotionally regulate, for us to be able to emotionally regulate and mood regulation, etc. So when we're cutting that off, which happens a lot, especially as we age, we might see more tendencies of kind of those early morning awakenings. And so there is absolutely validity to this concept of can we almost capture another sleep cycle, which does tend to have some of that timeline of around 60 minutes to 90 minutes, depending on the person. And so yes, so being able to cultivate that, and then that also goes into, I think even before we hit record, you all were speaking to kind of some of these really important intuitive check-ins on our health and well-being versus over optimization. And that's one of the pieces for sleep that comes out of CBTI is learning to check in with your body, to see, is there still kind of that adenosine left in the tank, if you will, that need for additional sleep, and can we go back into that? So yes, I think you're wise on that. Now, the fact that you have been someone that has been able to manage your sleep without an alarm is really, really fantastic and tends to be a great indicator of strong circadian health if we're finding that we're largely waking up at around the same time. Many people, if they have not been exhibiting that, or there's been a lot of movement in their sleep-wake timing or struggles throughout the whole course of the night, they barely were sleeping and now they're just finally got to sleep, so they're going to push it out. All those can be examples of times where, for at least for a period, we might want to bring in alarms or ways for them to bring about consistency, because that's the place where we always start versus bedtime. We often start with wake up time because bedtime, it could be just another source of pressure for a lot of people to say, okay, fall asleep at 10. And you're like, oh no, well, now it's 10:20 and now it's 10:40. So instead of getting all stressed out, you can set the stage and what have you, but trust that you're still going to get up at about the same time, plus or minus around 30 minutes. And then that can over time help anchor you back, and that can kind of course correct your bedtime. So Donna, it's great. It sounds like you're got a good system there.
Well, but it gets thrown off. I mean, so
Yeah.
let's walk into the next level of this. One of the
Sure.
things I've noticed is that when I'm under stress, whether it's professionally or socially or whatever,
Sure.
I have these 3 o'clock wake ups.
Mm-hmm.
3:30, 3 o'clock, 3:30. And I've heard people talk about that is a cortisol response, that there is a cortisol bounce taking right there. Your thoughts?
Okay, so good. Because you are not alone, and out of U.S. News and World Reports, just for 2025, they did a recent survey, and they found it was in mid 80s, like around I want to say like 83, 85% or something along those lines of participants finding frequent wake ups as part of their struggles with their sleep. So it is pervasive, wake ups throughout the course of the night. And so we always want to assess wake ups. So we're having acute periods of wake ups, to your point around, is it like work related, social, etc. So what's going on with these wake ups? Then when we are waking up, how long do we tend to be awake? What is the difficulty in falling back asleep? What is the upset? Are we really relating to this in a negative way? Or is it just, oh, I'm awake, okay, and going back to sleep soon, or trusting? So we kind of, identify what's going on, what is the scope of these wake ups. But then I recently did an IG Live where I just spoke to 22 potential reasons for those wake ups. So just know that there can be many, many, many reasons for wake ups in the event that someone's like, well, I don't know if cortisol fits for me. But I will say it's very pervasive. That one's a big one. So that can very commonly be a big factor. And when we think about cortisol, if we are having consistent wake up time, depending on what time you might be waking up, in the hours before you're waking up, that cortisol is starting to rise. And then if we do have kind of imbalances there, it could be elevating more than we'd like and impacting your sleep. But then there are a ton of other reasons. So there can be irregularity in our sleep schedule. There can be alcohol, THC, et cetera, that can be throwing things off. That metabolic piece. So that's one of the reasons why CGMs, and one of the reasons why Oura just spent millions of dollars connecting and partnering up, right, with Dexcom. Oh, you got one on too?
I've got one on, yeah.
Okay,
That's
exactly.
so good.
Yeah, because, it's clearly was enough of a connection or tie-in for them to be willing to spend millions to link these two, kind of components together, because that one is just so, so prevalent. We had Ben Azadi on the podcast recently, and how he described it was if you're walking down a street with 100 people, then 93 of them on average have massive metabolic dysfunction. So most of us are going to see all kinds of craziness, especially while we're sleeping. And sleep tends to be kind of a mirror of how you're living your days. So if your days are all over the place, both with glucose or stress and cortisol and what have you, we're likely to see that mirroring while you're sleeping. So that metabolic health, but then it can also be temperature is a huge, huge one. Don, I think you were saying you travel with the cooling mattress toppers, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, which can sound like such a small thing. How could that be such a big deal? But temperature, the number of people actually have a sleep audit right after this, and I already reviewed all their data. And right off the bat, I mean, they're sleeping at like 75 degrees. So I got something for you. But, there's so many things that you would think would just be like a given, and yet, unfortunately, not, because many people don't realize that even on the Sleep Foundation, the recommendation is between 60 to 67 degrees for ambient temperature. But then that's just ambient temperature, not pointing to the fact that we can be cooking under our, in a foam mattress with duvets, and, our body temperature is almost 100 degrees. So then by, after 7 to 8 hours or what have you, then that's going to get really hot throughout the course of the night if you don't have other options for most people. Temperature, then we can look at also more kind of clinical things. Anxiety, depression can certainly show up in our sleep results, and as well as that sleep fragmentation. And then it does get into that testing piece. So then we see, are you in a room that has high CO2 levels? Are you in are the humidity levels? Are the mold? Are we dealing with parasites? Are we, then this is where the rabbit hole can be vast. But for many people, some of those heavy hitters, like you're speaking to, cortisol, blood sugar, consistency, sleep regularity, a lot of these can be big hits in a positive direction.
That's so cool. Now, so we've talked about a couple levels of technology. We've talked about an Oura Ring. We've talked about a CGM. We've talked about EEG tools. In your experience, so you have experience of comparing, Oura is one of the things they're famous for is giving you rather extensive sleep data. And I think from the wearable technology side, I think their data is really good, it looks like. How good is it, though, when you compare it to a real sleep study? I mean, are they close?
Yeah, good questions. 100%. And I think I am so excited for this space because we know that there's already new players that are coming on the market and in the game, that it's going to get really exciting. And also there's lots of rumbles of different FDA cleared items, so that could even be diagnostic versus just consumer grade
Interesting. Okay.
tracking. Yes, so that could get really exciting. So what I'd say is, one, Aura is legally allowed to kind of make some of these statements where they say it's like having a sleep lab on your finger, because they have about 1,500 nights against PSG. And so now some of the numbers, so some of the data fares better than others. So sleep, just are you asleep or are you awake? They tend to do pretty decent with that in the kind of low 90s, which is, decent for, again, consumer grade tech. But then across the board, for most hand and wrist-based trackers, the sleep stage classifications tend to be where they are not quite as accurate. Now, Aura, with their latest update, they were at around 79% accuracy for sleep stage classifications, but which can at first glance sound like, oh, but then you hear about PSGs being only around the mid 80s for accuracy. And so agreeability. So if different people are looking at the same, lab participant, only around mid, 83, 85% of the time do they have agreement. So that's the gold standard. And so if Aura is around like 79%, not that far off. So, and that's not to say there's some fantastic other wearables too. Whoop is doing some really exciting things. I know we've spoken about some other players in the game too that are really got some cool things coming. Happy Ring is another one that's gunning for FDA clearance. Bond, there's all these different ones that I think could shake things up quite a bit.
But you got to keep an eye on it, because I read an article this morning that Whoop successfully defended their patent against two of their competitors that are no longer allowed to sell in the United States.
Yeah,
So
100%.
they're scrapping out there. Klaudia wrote this line. I'm not taking credit for this.
What did I write?
But how do you use your data without becoming neurotic? Just asking for a friend.
Yes, that's a great question, because it's true, because we have research to support that is a very real problem. Some of the research looks like telling participants that slept fine, you slept horrible, and then them kind of setting their behaviors, error rates and other things going up by virtue of them thinking and framing their day from a day of, oh, this is going to be a rough day. Here we go. And so it's very real. I mean, that's one of the most fascinating things, I think, is health psychology, of just how much our health is impacted by how we're thinking about some of these components like sleep. And so the nocebo effect is very real. So we want to be really, really mindful. This is where I would love for some of these wearables to allow alternate ways of logging. So I would be so wonderful if I could have people wearing these wearables, but then they don't see the day-to-day data, but it streams through on our dashboard. And then, once a week, a couple times a month or whatever, we review, we discuss, and then we kind of course correct, but without getting really thrown back day to day. And HRV is one that we see so many people totally getting stressed, even though it says variability in the title. It's trying to say, alert, don't get too nuts with this one. But I understand. I mean, I've absolutely been one of those people too. And I was like, oh, what is going on? Why is my HRV tanking? blah, blah, blah. And then, so then, you kind of can adjust your behaviors throughout the course of through that period of time versus doing what we know to do, which is to zoom out and look at the trends and trust that there's going to be things that we can bring about that can absolutely help support an upticking in for the average person. For most of the people that come our way, we're able to markedly turn their HRV over a period of time, but it always does take that period of time. But then we get to see that really exciting trend elevation. So the answer is it does seem to be a case by case basis. Now, at the same time, what I'll say, because I see a lot in the sleep space where there might be a lot of people where they'll say, ugh, you don't want to do that. Just, kind of err on the side of listening to your body and what have you. But I would argue that where appropriate and where we're not getting into the realm of neuroticism, extreme chronic cases of insomnia, et cetera, if those things are not there, then what I tend to see is a massive impact on sleep kind of accountability, leadership, responsibility, if you will, where you're starting to identify things that you're doing in your own life that are showing up in surprising ways in your nervous system metrics, as well as our sleep specific metrics. So that starts to give more agency to bring things back to you to be able to make a difference there. And then also a common thing is known as paradoxical insomnia, where people will go to bed and then they say, oh my God, I barely slept last night. I got next to no sleep. But if we are, kind of having them on a PSG and then we can see, actually, you slept like 6 hours. You totally were. But that's that paradoxical insomnia. And it doesn't mean that we just gaslight them and say, oh, you're fine, go away. Instead, we say, okay, well, one, the body is massively intelligent and does tend to still gain or garner in whether it's micro sleeping or periods of sleep where it's pulling opportunity to sleep, but the perception is altered for that individual right now. Maybe they're really trending in a sympathetic dominant state or what have you. So for that period of time, it's feeling like they didn't get much sleep, but wearables can often help alleviate some of those fears because then they can say, oh, okay, I did get some sleep. Maybe it wasn't the best night, but if it was left to just them, they might have thought they got no sleep when actually that might not be as accurate as it can be. So when you talk about improving a skill, it can often help us to know how you're doing in that skill. So wearables can be a helpful kind of proxy.
It's such a great point, and we have it written down which exactly what you're just talking about, how data can empower self-awareness and sustainable habit and behavioral change. And
Yeah.
I know we're coming to the end, so I just have a couple of questions, but I'm curious, would you be able to give us like an overview, don't have to go into the nitty-gritty, of what a Oura audit sounds like, looks like? Because I know a lot of our listeners are either wearing something or curious to wear something, so they might be interested to see what are some of the things to look at, not necessarily on a night-to-night basis, but on a trend basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm about to hop onto one right after this, so I have it in front of me. So we've got basically what we do is we have people link up their Oura Ring data. So we have a Teams dashboard. Hope you can hear me over a helicopter. See, this is part of what happens when you're doing
You're outside.
your podcast outside. But so what ends up happening is we send them a very in-depth sleep assessment. So they are answering tons and tons of questions around their sleep in many different categories. So that takes them a little bit of time to fill out. Then we're bringing that in through with AI and then also linking up Oura Ring on the dashboard. So then we can look at based on their subjective experience of their sleep and their how they're relating to their sleep results, as well as the more objective data, and then see how they're all aligning. And then we have kind of a particular thing that we walk through of many kind of phases and things to address right out of the gate. And then we put that onto a PDF and kind of give a presentation for them around what's happening with their sleep. So right away, they can start to make some of those changes. But with that, there often can be different opportunities depending on how extensive or how kind of intricate their case might be. So for some people, it might be really layered. They might have been on Xanax, Ambiens, et cetera, for decades. And, So they've got a whole list of considerations. Then they've got health issues. So there can be really layered ones
Yeah.
or kind of straightforward ones. And so depending, either way, we're always going to leave them with very clear action items to address right out of the gate. And if they want to address things or get additional support, whether accountability, like in our cohorts or one-on-ones, those are all options too. If they need some of that, ways of partnering so that they can, because really a lot of these things are total lifestyle revamps for the average person. So that's where it can get really value or be very valuable to have kind of a community approach there. But bare minimum, they're left with kind of a whole rundown and analysis of their sleep, their stats, because we've now looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Oura Ring users, and we can kind of see how they're stacking up and with actionable things that they can do right away.
Very good.
Thank you.
You mentioned the EEG. Have you seen a consumer grade wearable EEG tool that you particularly care for, or is that still in the realm of medical laboratory science?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there is. So, for instance, Dream was one that was more available for a while, but now it's kind of has some extra red tape. Then Muse, the newer Muse, does have the EEG components, but to really utilize what we often are doing is more clinical. So it's diagnostic. So those can be really important because when we're looking at those over, 100 sleep-wake disorders, most average home sleep tests are really addressing respiratory-based disorders for the most part. So it's how are you breathing? What is your heart rate looking like throughout the course of the night, et cetera. So that's going to capture some of the most prevalent, I would say, or common sleep disorders, looking like sleep apnea, namely, is certainly what we're looking for. But also it might clue us into could upper airway resistance syndrome be at play, et cetera. But these other ones, so now we do have additional access to clinical grade tests that kind of act as an between going all the way into a lab, but also sleeping at home, which for athletes especially too, this can be really valuable to see day to day and for everyone. But certainly it's getting a lot of notoriety in the athlete space because then we can test with EEG. We also put all kinds of markers onto our arms and legs so we can get other information about other types of sleep disorders like restless leg syndrome, periodic leg movement disorder. We can start to see other things about the quality of those sleep stages that we're kind of venturing into without having to go in lab and or seeing is there something in your sleep space that is impacting your ability to get quality sleep. So that can be really important too, because then we can revamp your sleep space.
So it sounds to me, just to recap, to me like the lab is extending into the home to a degree, but we don't have this wearable piece. Again, you said that Oura has permission to say a sleep lab on your finger because they're within 10 points of lab data. And so as we close up, I counsel my clients or my athletes I'm working with, I'm like, listen, if you've got 7 nights of good sleep, one bad night is not going to throw you off. And conversely, one good night of sleep will not make up for 7 bad ones.
So wise. Yeah.
So this is and I'll tell you, as we're looking at Oura, the more I look at wearable data, I'm blessed with the ability to look at the number, take it in, and wash it off. Now, I'll go back and look at trend data. It's almost like we need to get these wearables to report trends first and acute data second. Would you agree with that?
I agree. Oh, 100%. Yeah, because I do feel like there's a number of clients that have come our way that they own Oura Rings or Whoop bands or whatever, and they're not wearing them because it was stressing them out so much. And so I feel like we're kind of eating away at potential opportunity because I'm just reading an article people are sending me about I think it was in the New York Post, where they were just featuring people who had been able to spot cancer with their Oura Rings, in advance of any of their doctors pointing to anything being awry. And I've seen that many, many times with my clients. And especially it was really evident during the pandemic where we would be able to spot days in advance where they would have signs of having COVID or other sicknesses. And so I think there can be a lot of benefits to tracking, but I think that can be the exciting next step is how are we digesting that data. And so maybe having like a briefing every month, how we're doing, every 2 weeks or something, so that we're getting more of the trends without getting lost in the, minutia of it all day to day.
I think the emergence of AI is going to help us with this dramatically. And
100%.
I'm waiting for, my friends out at the UFC Performance Institute, they do a really cool job. They publish their data every year. They have a report that they publish. Here's
So
what we
great.
saw, the good, the bad, the ugly, the ranges. Man, I'll tell you what, if Aura, if you're listening, put this into a guide. What did you see? What did
Yeah,
you learn? Because what we know is that HRV runs from 0 to 150. Where you are in there is how we work with you is dramatically different.
totally.
And I've got to imagine the sleep can be similar. That you're going to see, listen, I think last night I had a 80 some percent sleep score, which an 80 below 80 sleep score. The night before I was a 92. And
Yeah,
I with the I think, tell me if I'm wrong, Aura changed their formula
yeah,
on their
they did.
sleep scores, because back on the early versions 1 and 2, I was a regular 95 to 90. I've never hit 100, but I was a
Yeah,
regular 95 to 98. Now
yeah,
my best nights I'm about a 92.
yeah,
So I think
yeah. They
they've
they
indexed their
markedly
formula a
changed.
little bit. Yeah.
Yes, they did. I mean, to the point that because when looking at it on the cloud, it looks so ridiculous for many people's stats. The most common thing that I see is deep sleep really massively dropping for people. And so this is where the sleep stage classifications and knowing which metrics are more accurate and which ones aren't is really important, because I would see people make real choices based off of the sleep stage classifications. And be like, no, like don't do that, because out of all of the data, that's like the least accurate, especially back then. I mean, it's gotten a little bit better, but it, used to be so. And I would see really big names speaking to this and saying, oh, look what I've done to maximize my deep sleep, my REM, and whatever. And then they were really upset when to overnight,
Yeah.
literally, the algorithm changes and now it's like cut in half or whatever.
Uh,
So yes, yes, yes. But I think you're right. AI is definitely gonna shake things up in so many domains. Also to exciting things like sleep age classifications. So like from a chronobiological perspective versus biological perspective. So meaning when we get our age, especially in the biohacking space, people might say, oh, well, biologically I'm, 20 years younger than my age or whatever. We can do that for sleep. And right now it's kind of regulated to different institutions and what have you of looking at sleep age. But we anticipate that will start rolling out to the average person soon. And so what that would look like is, 50 years old, but you're maybe sleeping like a 72-year-old or something along those lines. So it can help quantify a bit more. And what are some of the common features of older sleeping is sleep fragmentation, waking up a bunch, like a lot of times, and having trouble maybe falling back asleep. Maybe shortened sleep duration, maybe more kind of napping schedules or kind of oddities in the timing of that sleep or the kind of banking of that sleep. There's a lot there that I think AI is going to really bust onto the scene with. So that's exciting as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to get to the point where we tell everybody where they can find out more about you, but there's just one more question I want to ask. I have like 3 final takeaways, but I'm going to do one of them.
Yes.
I see a lot of people walking around wired and tired.
Oh, yeah.
This whole term has become such a buzzword and people use it all the time. What would you recommend? Maybe like 3 habits, 3 takeaways that they can do that are easy and not like breaking the bank type of thing for them to address that feeling of wired and tired.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think, I'd often have some follow-up questions for them on the wired and tired, just because there's 2 things. One, if there is the group that, and this is important for anyone listening with sleep, we address these 2 buckets of people really differently. So one being if they're dealing with insomnia, difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, versus just the person that maybe they're sleeping, but it's not that great, or they could be better. For that group, we might be educating on all the perils of not sleeping, what could happen to just about every area of your health and well-being being impacted. So, we could go to town on all of those stats. But for the insomniac, that can actually make it worse for them because they often are very educated around sleep, too much so sometimes, because now they are terrified. They've read, Dr. Matthew Walker's book and what have you, and now they're so scared of what could be happening to their sleep when it's not working. So for that group, we might also speak to oddly, kind of helping to build that sleep resiliency. And that this goes into CBTI, this concept that, all right, well, maybe right now you are wired and tired. So maybe we're going to step into acceptance of right now, maybe this is a season of your life where our nervous system is a little burnt out or whatever. And so the acceptance of that state versus making it wrong or freaking out about it or trying to force sleep to come, because oftentimes that's where we see, kind of disorders show up. So if that is that group, then we might bring about CBTI, ACTI. So I'd have them look into things like that. So for instance, the Sleep Book by Guy Meadows is a great one for insomniacs that might be especially wired and tired because they find that often they might be a group that's spending too much time in bed. We see that a ton.
Mm.
So they'll say, oh, I'm going to go to bed really early tonight. And so then they go to bed really early, but now they're not tired. Maybe they fall asleep almost like a nap and now they're up. So we might actually be condensing, shortening that window. So then that can just change, be life changing in a very short period of time for that particular group. And then for everyone across the board, 2 anchor habits that we always bring in is real management of their light dark systems, which, can sound at first glance as not a big deal, but it actually does take a lot of planning and strategizing on what that can look like. We often use the My Circadian app and start educating on the lux in their environment, the timing of sunrise, UVA, UVB in their space, where they are, getting enough skin exposure, eye exposure to that sun, and the difference that that can make for their health and well-being and their sleep, of course, and then total darkness at night. And so how can we set up there? So your house should look kind of weird at night is kind of what we're going for, kind of brothel-esque. And so you're doing all those things, but the other anchor habit too would be the consistent wake time. So that's one that sounds like Don has been able to largely, where possible, have that consistency. And that's what we're looking to have people have routinely and ideally aligned with the rhythms of nature. And that's 7 days a week. And that's not, just Monday through Friday. And then the weekends are all crazy.
Janky. Yeah.
So those are some of the things that we bring in, but that's where, for instance, that sleep assessment is so long for a reason, because sometimes for the different people, these levers can totally shift for different reasons altogether. For some people, they're totally sedentary. They're not moving their body, and we start getting them moving and we build muscle mass, and, that impacts their sleep quality, quantity, etc. For other people, it's not that. It's major trauma. And so we need to address some of that or what have you. This is where that bioindividuality aspect comes in. But this is why I feel like I have hit the jackpot on the topic of things to, devote my life to, because you could never get bored, because just about every single thing in your life will show up in your sleep. So it's really fascinating, because for some people, you might be lonely as can be. Maybe you're not socializing. You have no community. There's so many things that could be impacting your sleep results. So that's where we want to go in deeper.
Mollie, you said some amazing things, and I'm looking at my list here, and I think we could do another hour easily with some of the questions I have. But without a doubt, I've been married for 35 years. For me to go to my wife and say, for me to sleep better, I need to go to a brothel, will not go over well. Okay,
I'm
just telling you.
In your own home. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Maybe that's what we got to work on.
Yeah, the devil's in the details.
Mollie, where's the best way to find you?
Yes. So at sleepisaskill.com, it serves as a bucket for a lot of different things. So one, you can take a sleep assessment right off the bat to get specific information back on things you can do right away. Then we have our podcast, we have our newsletter, we have those Oura Ring audits, we have our cohorts, our one-on-ones. Also on social media, we're trying to get out more information. So different ways that you could at least just be in the conversation for no dollars, and just, building that skill set. And then if you do look and want that extra support, then that's also available as well.
So someone can go to your website and sign up for your newsletter. You said it earlier. Every Monday it comes out. It's automatic.
Yes.
That's painless. I'll tell you, I would like to put in a pitch for your husband's newsletter as well.
Oh, yes.
I love his newsletter. It's one of my favorites. I love yours too, but his is
Yes.
it's
His
from
is
a
pretty
strategic
crazy.
thinking standpoint.
Oh,
It
yeah.
is Blake's newsletter is outstanding. BlakeEastman.com, I think, is where
I'm
you find that.
so glad you said that. Yes, he is quite, so it has kind of a Sherlock leaning. So for anyone listening, it's the behavioralist. And so looking at kind of reading people, and that's partly a component on how I've dove into poker is because he was a high stakes poker player. And so we've been in the poker space for a long time. I did one of the largest studies ever conducted on poker players and broke down their nonverbals, blink rate, sweat, stress, heart rate variability, et cetera, and would see with RFID tagged tables, what would happen when they would get certain hands and, the whole thing. So that
cool.
paired, yeah, and now using the AI aspect of things. So AI mapping of your face to see, what's happening, even on Zoom
It's
calls
not
or
fair.
whatever.
This isn't even fair anymore.
Oh,
I mean,
gosh, yeah.
if the haves and have-nots.
It's so, and then also, by the way, as another pitch for sleep, when we are sleep deprived, our ability to read other people, facial expressions, etc., can be wildly impacted. So just another reason to get your sleep in from even an EQ perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much,
Awesome.
Molly, for taking the time. And I know you got to run for an audit, but we
I
really
know.
appreciate you. People can also find you, Sleep is a Skill on Instagram, Sleep is a Skill podcast, all the things. Go listen. And gosh, yeah, the emails are so dense. You go into so many cool little studies and just breaking down. Yes, it's not just like, hey, what's going on? This is my sleep. No, it's super deep.
Yes.
Cool.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. We're going to play with some new things too. I want to start spotlighting more people because for a while there, we did spotlights of kind of screenshots of people's sleep stats, and we kind of somehow got away from that. I want to bring that back. So there's going to be a lot of new ways to highlight different angles with sleep.
Awesome.
Very
Well,
good.
for our audience, subscribe, like, comment, let us know what you want to hear next. We are coming back next week.
Beautiful.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
That's
you.
awesome.